Hello everyone. I had to do a voiceover for this video. It was such a lovely day on Saturday. Everybody was out in their gardens, jet washing and all sorts, so it was a bit noisy, so I couldn't record. So here I am starting off the sculpture. I've taken 3 5-foot rods. The butt end of the rods, the thick end of the rods, is going to be the front of the heron. And I'm using the tapered end of one of these rods to bind all 3 rods onto the arch of the metal former, which is the legs. I'm just binding around and around to create sort of like a firm fixing on the metal. And I'll do the same with the tapered end of another rod in a moment. With this rod, you'll notice that I bind it up and along the thick end of the rods, like in a spiral, and back again. Now, it makes it much easier to actually manipulate the rods, bend them into the right shape, and I want this to be bent up because it's going to form the heron's neck, which is really quite an interesting sort of almost S shape. So it's important that we're able to bend those rods, and if you spiral another rod up it, then it makes it much easier to bend. Now I'm just continuing the same process with the tapered end of another rod, creating a little triangulation between the metal former of the legs and the spine of the heron. Starting the inner layers of sculpture, working from the inside out for this main part of the heron's body. Creating a few more slightly deeper triangulations for the sort of belly of the heron. Again, fixing at the legs to the spine and back across to the legs again. And you can see there I just pulled the neck up a little bit using the willow to hold it in place by bracing it to one of the legs on the metal former. Notice at the moment there are some cavities and some hollow areas, and watch as I bring the tapered end of rods back through that cavity to fill it up so that we get like a lattice work of weave there, and it begins to become more densified. Creating a little bit more form here, going towards the heron's tail. Each time bringing rods back through, pushing them into those hollow areas to begin with, and then weaving them back through, creating a lattice work of weave and density. One of the tricky things I find students find it difficult to grasp is to not make this lattice work of weave too dense. And there's a fine line between it being too dense and too loose, and it's trying to create that balance as you're building up layers of shape and form. But if it's too dense, then it's very difficult to push rods into it, and if it's too loose, the rods that you push into it don't fix. So it's trying to create a balance where you have a lattice work of weaving that's dense enough for you to push rods into for them to get a purchase, without being so dense you can't find anywhere to push them in. Always trying to cross rods over one another. So each time you place a new rod, try and make sure it crosses a previous rod at a subtle angle. I'm going to create the that little hump, which is sort of like the top of the shoulders of the wings of the heron here. So I'm using the tension in the thick part of the rod to create that sort of quite distinct shape and form. And that's what the willow is really good for this, because you can get some lovely curves and shapes with the willow, and by using the tension in the rod and not breaking the tension in the rod, and not actually, it won't snap completely, but if you break the tension in the rod, then you get a sharp angle on the rod. So I'm trying to keep the nice curve of the thick end of the butt end of the rod by not breaking the tension in it. And that's how I'm creating that hump on the top of the heron's back, sort of where the shoulders and the wings come from. Notice how I weave the tapered end of the rods through the hollow areas, and when I want to create more volume, I'll lay new rods over the top of form I've already created. But to maintain the density, I have to weave some of those tapered ends back through the hollow cavities. Thinking here a little bit about the sharp angle between the hump on the heron's back and the neck, and thinking about how I'm going to segue that into the neck and create a more smoother line. Using new rods now to create a little bit more form, going up the sort of throat, the front of the throat towards the heron's neck. Creating a smoother, more fluid line between that hump on the back of the heron's back into where it joins the neck. Notice that I don't always weave rods, in fact quite often don't weave rods right through to the end. I leave them poking out where they've come out, and they will be very useful later on when we come to that area. And I will every so often weave all of those rods in and through, and they'll all add to density and form. I'm looking at the base of the neck here, and I can see that it's not at the right angle yet, so it needs a little bit more tweaking. It's really important when you're working on a sculpture, or any piece of art really, to keep stepping back and walking around and viewing your piece from a distance, because it's very easy when you're working very close to something to lose shape and form quite quickly. That can happen quite quickly. So it's always say every 10-15 minutes or so, take a step back, walk around and just check your shape and form against the photographs or the images and pictures that you're working from. It can be really quite satisfying actually sewing in all of those ends that have been left poking out from before, and it quite quickly you can kind of get a rhythm going, and it can quite quickly build up some nice shape and form, and starts creating more of a surface texture as well. I'm looking at my pictures now, and I can see that I'm looking at where I need to build up a bit more shape and form, and I'm seeing where there are hollows and cavities that need to be filled in and woven across, and that's what I'm going to do now. And you'll see me here not weaving rods right through to the end. I'm just concentrating on that hollow area sort of just under the front chest that needs some rods woven across and through it. So you'll see as I weave in a couple of rods going in one direction, I'll start then to weave another rod across or through them, so that I am creating weave rather than my rods all going in the same direction. Now I'm coming to the outer layers of the heron's body. I'm starting to be a little bit more careful about the placement of my rods, and really thinking about how I can create a nice appearance and a sort of more fluid lines for a surface texture, although this probably won't be the surface. But if I start now, by the time I get to doing the final layer, the layers beneath it will already have a nice surface texture themselves, and I'll have had some good practice of doing that technique. So it's best to start now, really, before you get to the end, with that technique, and you start to get those fluid lines quite early on. I'm creating the heron's tail, the end of the heron's tail now, and I'm using rods that I bring from the underside of the heron's belly and bringing them along to the tail. So that ensures a nice line between those two areas of form of the heron's, whole complete shape. So it's bringing rods from one area into another area, and creating that sort of quite distinct shape of a heron's tail as well, which is quite blunted really. It's sort of a V shape, but it's quite blunted. It's not a typical bird's tail. And here you can see a sort of close-up of where rods are all crossing each other, and here on the top I've started to sort of give the impression almost of feathers with making sure that my rods don't cross at such acute angles, so they're crossing at more subtle angles, and just noticing a few cavities that need to be weaved across and through. Okay, well I think we'll leave it here for today. Tomorrow I'll be working on the head, and so the next video will be showing you how to do those sort of details like the head, the tops of the legs, and the surface texture, the finishing touches. Sorry about the rather poor sound quality. I'm using the microphone on my laptop and doing quite quick edits because I just want to get these videos out to you as quick as possible. And thanks for watching. Bye.